Picking up from the last video, we learned that there are private perspectives and social perspectives. The private perspective on education allocation is considering private costs and benefits. This is where, for example, you decide to go to college based on the benefits to you and the costs to you. But almost every allocation involves external costs and benefits in addition to those that are private. Considering both how the decision affects you and the rest of society is taking a social perspective. So differences between the social and private internal rate of return can cause inefficient allocations. The private internal rate of return is based on your costs and benefits. The social internal rate of return is based on all costs and benefits, yours and those that are external. So efficiency would occur when these two equate. That's unlikely to happen because it would assume that there is no external cost and benefit from this allocation. In other words, it would assume that when you make a decision to go to college, you don't affect others. More likely, either there will be an under-allocation or an over-allocation. Let's look at both. An under-allocation towards college would occur if the social internal rate of return is greater than the private internal rate of return. Another way of putting this is you undervalue education because you fail to consider a lot of the external benefits that society does. You think about the benefit of a higher wage and the benefit of a better job, but you fail to consider that by getting an education, you actually lower crime rates and increase political participation, among other things. That creates a private internal rate of return that is less than what society would see. Resources could be overallocated if the opposite happens. In this case, the social internal rate of return would be less than the private internal rate of return. In other words, you are overvaluing that education. You're failing to see many of the costs that society is seeing, and therefore attaching more value to that education than what society would want you to. There's no perfect allocation in the real world, but it is worth understanding how there is this difference in perspective between what society sees as the value of an educational investment and what you, as an individual, the decision makers, see as the value of that educational investment. To the extent they diverge, we're either going to get too much or too little education. Now let's move on and talk about the demand for human capital. In this section, we're actually going to build a demand-side model for education. To do that, on the horizontal axis, we're going to put the years of schooling. And these could be whatever increments you deem useful, but for our purposes, let's say it's a associate's degree, E1, a bachelor's degree, E2, and then a master's degree, E3, okay? Each about 2 years apart. On the vertical axis, we're going to put the internal rate of return, abbreviated R. Remember from the last slide that the internal rate of return is really the value that we get from that educational investment. So for example, E1 yields a value of R1. E2 yields a value of R2. And E3 yields a value of R3. Note that as we increase our educational attainment, the internal rate of return is going down. That's illustrating a fundamental principle in economics. It's called diminishing marginal benefits. As we get more education, we end up getting lower incremental benefits. Now that may sound odd because you say, well, I know that a master's degree gets you a higher income than a bachelor's degree, which gets you a higher income than an associate's. Isn't that increasing benefits? Yes, but that's total benefits are increasing. Here we're looking at marginal benefits. So as we move from each increment of education to a higher one, the incremental value is going down. The marginal benefit is dropping. Let me give you an example of why. If you are going to retire in your career at, say, 60, and you pursue an associate's degree, maybe you finish that degree when you're 20. About 2 years it takes, so 18 to 20 you go to school, and now you've got that degree. Well, by retiring at 60, you've got 40 years of earnings ahead of you. Those 40 years are going to bring you incremental earnings, as we learned in the previous slides. And it is those incremental earnings and that long stream that you're going to have of future earnings, 40 years, that creates a pretty high internal rate of return. However, as you continue to pursue education, say a bachelor's degree, now you've got 2 more years ahead of you. Now you finish at age 22. Now you only have 38 years to get incremental earnings. Hence, the internal rate of return, the marginal benefit of that bachelor's degree, is going to be lower. And then when you go for a master's degree, takes you 2 more years, now you've got effectively a 24-year-old that will have 36 years of income streams ahead of them, yielding an even lower internal rate of return. Hence, as we pursue more education, we get older, and the time frame over which we can recover that income stream gets shorter and shorter. Imagine the internal rate of return for somebody that finishes their master's degree when they're 58 years old. They have 2 years of work and income stream ahead of them. Well, the internal rate of return for that master's degree is going to be really low. All right, hopefully that helps us understand the shape of this relationship here. And it is downward sloping. This actually lays out our demand curve, because if this is the return that we're getting on the vertical axis and this is the quantity of schooling, then it really tells us just how much value we are getting from each unit. And that's what a demand curve does. It tells us for any particular quantity of a good, or in this case schooling, what is the value that we get from that. Once you have that information, you can then start to talk about the cost. The cost is the interest rate. This is what we actually have to give up in order to get this education. And the way you want to think about this is as a horizontal line that is given to us based on market conditions. So interest rates right now, for example, are relatively low. It could be higher in the future, but they're low now. And so we take whatever the interest rate is. And this is pretty much the way people think about education, because you look at the return you can get, which is the demand curve, and then you say, okay, how much would it cost me to borrow the funds to actually get that education? And now you have this interest rate. According to this diagram, we have the benefit side of this market and the cost side, and we can now determine what the optimal allocation is of education. This person, faced with the demand and interest rate conditions, would definitely pursue an associate's degree, E1, because by doing that, they would get an internal rate of return higher than the interest rate and benefit in a positive way. They could go as high as a bachelor's degree, because they would at that point, break even. They would get an internal rate of return that would equal their interest rate. They, however, would not pursue a master's degree, because doing this would actually cause an internal rate of return that is lower than their interest rate. So based on the information we have here, this person would pursue a bachelor's degree and no less or more. Next, let's use our model and analyze how some other factors could influence the decision to go to college. For example, people have different abilities when it comes to succeeding in college. Let's say we have two individuals. We have person A. Person A is going to be a low ability person and represented by this demand curve here. And we have person B. Person B is going to be a high ability person and represented by this demand curve here. Notice that for every level of schooling, person B has a higher internal rate of return than person A. It doesn't mean that person B is better than person A, smarter than person A, or anything like that. What it means is that when it comes to the ability to succeed in college, person B has an advantage and is going to be able to get more out of that college than person A. And you might know this, or you might know people that are like this. Some people will say, oh, I have to do things that are hands-on. I don't like sitting in a classroom. I don't do well with deadlines. A whole host of things that might make someone learn better in an alternative venue. Some people do better in vocational type training or trade schools, whereas other people do better in more of the traditional college environment. So that's the case with B. B is able to get more out of college because of his abilities compared to A. Well, how is this going to affect the college decision? Well, if they both face the same interest rate for funding college, you'll notice that A is going to pursue, it looks like, an associate's degree, let's say, by finding the intersection of their demand curve and the interest rate curve, whereas B is going to go on and pursue a bachelor's degree and get that higher level of education. It's not just ability that influences a person's decision to go to college. Another factor could be discrimination. Let's say now that they both have the same ability to do well in college, but B doesn't face discrimination in the labor market, whereas A does. Well, B is going to get more out of that education at every level than A. B is going to get a higher internal rate of return at every level of education than A. So what's going to happen? A is going to pursue less education, maybe an associate's degree, compared to B. And then finally, let's consider the costs of funds. The truth is that not everybody faces the same interest rates when going to borrow for college. Let's say that in this case, A actually faces a higher interest rate than B. So they may have the same ability, they may face the same level of discrimination in the marketplace. The only difference is, for A, they're going to have to pay more to borrow money than B. And that means A is going to choose a lower level of education compared to B. The combination of ability differences, potential discrimination, as well as the cost of funds leads to different choices when it comes to pursuing college. Now, we just looked at 3 variables here. Of course, there are others, but it helps us get the process of analysis and understand why 2 people might choose different levels of education. There is also sometimes a compounding effect. For example, if A has a lower ability and A faces discrimination, A is probably going to find that they're going to have to pay more to borrow money to go to college because the banks are not going to be willing to take as much of a risk by lending them funds. The next thing we're going to do is talk about on-the-job training. This is the same economic analysis that we use for the human capital investment in college. But instead of this being a decision for the worker, this is a decision that the firm makes. When you decide to go to college, you look at the costs and benefits and decide whether it's a worthy pursuit. Whereas on-the-job training, your employer looks at the costs and benefits and determines if it's a worthy pursuit. More on that in the next video.